As George turned onto his street, something immediately felt off. From a distance, he could see that the garage door was wide open, something that was very out of the ordinary. Concerned but not yet alarmed, he parked and made his way into the house. The moment he stepped inside, his world stopped. There on the living room floor was Shauna, motionless. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone and dialed 911. Struggling to stay calm, he told the emergency dispatcher exactly what he had seen, his voice breaking with fear and confusion. By the time the first paramedics arrived, it was already too late. Shauna was gone. Shona Ann Castleton entered the world on a chilly spring day, March 13, 1966, in the scenic and serene city of Salt Lake City, Utah. She was born into a loving family, the cherished daughter of William and Nancy Castleton. From the beginning, Shona stood out for her warmth, curiosity, and sense of humor. Family photos from that time show a young girl with a radiant smile that lit up every room she entered. In 1978, when Shona was just 12 years old, her family made the first of two major moves that would shape her adolescence. The Castletons relocated to Pennsylvania, driven by William's career opportunities. 2 years later, the Castleton family packed up once again, this time for Northern Virginia. It was here that Shona spent her formative teenage years, attending both middle school and then high school in the bustling DC suburbs. Despite the challenges of moving frequently, Shona embraced each new school, blending in with her peers and excelling academically. For someone as full of energy, life, and charm as Shona, a place like Las Vegas would eventually feel like the perfect match. In 1994, at the age of 28, she made the bold decision to leave her hometown and begin a new chapter in the heart of Nevada's entertainment capital. Las Vegas was a city of reinvention, a place where people could chase dreams, start fresh, and find opportunity at every turn. Her first job in Las Vegas was in the cosmetics department of a high-end department store on Fifth Avenue. Though it paid the bills, the position didn't quite align with her ambitions, so she shifted gears. Not long after settling in, she landed a job as a cocktail waitress at a newly launched casino. For the next 11 years, Shona poured her heart into her work, not just serving drinks, but building relationships, spreading joy, and becoming a familiar, comforting presence to both staff and patrons. Though she received frequent attention and plenty of romantic offers from guests and coworkers alike, Shona wasn't interested in casual flings or fleeting romances. She believed in deep connection and genuine love. Then one ordinary evening at work, fate stepped in. A handsome man caught her eye across the casino floor. He stood tall with an athletic frame and an easy, magnetic smile that drew people in effortlessly. His name was George Teefee, and he worked as a firefighter for the Las Vegas Fire Department. He was known for his bravery, his discipline, and his calm under pressure. But with Shona, he was gentle, kind, and surprisingly poetic. From the very beginning, there was an undeniable chemistry between the two. Their conversations lasted hours, and it quickly became clear that they shared not just attraction, but values, hopes, and dreams. George wasn't just good-looking. He was thoughtful, compassionate, and deeply respectful. To Shona, it felt as though she had finally found the person she was meant to be with. Within a year of their passionate courtship, their love blossomed into something even more profound. The birth of their daughter, whom they named Madison. The arrival of their child marked a turning point in both of their lives. George embraced fatherhood with tenderness and pride, while Shona, now a mother, radiated happiness. She would often say that becoming Madison's mom was the most meaningful role she had ever taken on. Her days were filled with lullabies, baby giggles, and long walks under the Nevada sun. In March of 2006, when Madison was 3 years old, George and Shona decided to officially tie the knot. The wedding was intimate but joyful, a celebration of love, resilience, and family. For a time, it seemed like the Teefees had built a life that could weather any storm. Friends described them as the picture of happiness, a devoted couple, raising a beautiful child, surrounded by the warmth of shared dreams. But like so many love stories, theirs took a complicated turn. The economic downturn of 2008 hit the couple hard. George had made risky financial decisions tied to the housing market, and as property values plummeted, their savings evaporated. The stress was immense. The confident man Shona had once known began to change, slowly and painfully. Under the weight of financial insecurity, George became withdrawn, irritable, and emotionally distant. He struggled with the fact that Shona, now working more hours to support the family, had become the primary breadwinner. This shift in roles made him feel diminished. For this very reason, George began to control how Shona spent their money, much of which Shona had earned through her own hard work and diligence. With each new month and year after the financial crisis, these problems only seemed to grow, adding further weight to their struggles. As if in a silent form of protest against his wife's growing independence, George made a decision to befriend a homeless drifter and hired him to do some yard work without even consulting her first. Shona was worried about their safety, especially when this unknown person was frequently on their property while George was away. Often Shona was home alone with Madison, and the man's presence made her feel vulnerable and unsettled. The growing chaos made her feel powerless and sad, yet Shona kept trying to hold everything together for the sake of their family, until there was no more strength left to endure the growing humiliations. Finally, in April 2012, Shona made a courageous decision to leave. She chose peace and stability for herself and her daughter, trusting that a new future was still possible. Shona was a strong woman, someone who excelled at her job, successfully adapted to a new routine, and made sure that little Madison wanted for nothing. The two of them settled into their new city apartment in suburban Summerlin, Nevada, just 30 minutes away from her workplace. Though Shona had lost her marriage, she still had Madison, the greatest blessing of her life, and a rewarding career to pursue. One evening in early September, after finishing her casino shift as usual, Shona made her way back home. The moment she stepped inside their new residence, a rush of disbelief washed over her. Something was not quite right. It was immediately clear someone had been there in her absence. Surprisingly, it wasn't a typical burglary. None of her valuable belongings were gone, except for her wedding ring, a symbol of promises made and promises broken. Instead, the intruder had left something bizarre in its place, a pair of men's boxer shorts in a small size. At that moment, perhaps due to overwhelm, disbelief, or a lingering hope for normalcy, Shona decided to let it be, a decision that would weigh upon her mind in the months to come. Early on the morning of September 29, 2012, a dramatic chain of events began to unfold. Events that would shock a community and forever alter the lives of those involved. At approximately 3 a.m., surveillance cameras in the casino captured the moment 46-year-old Shona Ta'afi finished her long overnight shift and walked toward the parking lot. Shona, a devoted mother and a hard-working woman, slipped into her car and began the 30-minute drive back home to suburban Summerlin, a quiet neighborhood where many families chose to raise their children, far away from the chaos of the Las Vegas Strip. Tragically, Shona would not make it safely to her bed that night. Shortly after parking her car in the garage and making her way up toward her townhouse, something awful happened. Shona was attacked right on the stairwell outside her home. The attack was so severe that Shona fell to the floor and was left there, unable to move or call for help. It was not until nearly 6 hours later, at approximately 9 a.m., that Shona's was discovered under dramatic and heartbreaking circumstances. George Ta'afi, Shona's estranged husband, finished his 24-hour shift at the fire station and then went to his mother's home to pick up their 8-year-old daughter, Madison. The little girl was supposed to spend the day with her father, but just as they were preparing to leave, Madison realized that she had forgotten something at her mother's townhouse, a small but cherished item. So George decided to make a brief stop by Shona's place to retrieve it. As George turned down their street, he noticed from a distance that the garage door was not locked, which seemed unusual. Nevertheless, he and Madison entered the residence together, a moment that would forever be seared into their memories, and stumbled upon Shona's on the living room floor. In shock and disbelief, George rushed his daughter back outside to protect her from the awful scene. With shaking hands, he called 911 and relayed all the details of what he had found to the emergency dispatcher, unsure of what might come next. At that point, George and Shona had been living separately for several months due to their ongoing divorce process, and he insisted he had no knowledge of anyone who might wish to harm her. When the first paramedics arrived at the scene, it was already much too late to save Shona. According to interviews with neighbors, the attack most likely occurred sometime between 3:30 and 4 in the morning. During that window, a nearby resident said he heard a brief commotion, a few suspicious noises, but did not pay much attention, thinking it might be a domestic dispute or some kind of minor incident. Naturally, the first person who fell under suspicion was Shona's former husband, George Teefee, a man from whom Shona was currently in the process of divorcing. However, investigators soon ruled him out as a suspect when they found that George was at the fire station, surrounded by colleagues for his 24-hour shift. A strong alibi that cleared him from any suspicion of wrongdoing. This left the case a puzzling mystery for both the police and the community. Some, especially Shona's sister Paula, remained unconvinced. In Paula's opinion, George was the only person who could possibly harm Shona, and she remained firm in her conviction, disregarding the facts that supported his alibi. Meanwhile, detectives kept all their options open and investigated other suspects. The case, which initially seemed perplexing and sad, soon began to gain momentum. Just 48 hours after Shona's death, the police received a phone call from a chance eyewitness, someone whose testimony would enable them to solve this puzzling case in record time. The caller was a man named William Panks, but many knew him simply as Big Will. William had been a fixture in Las Vegas for many years and was well known as a maintenance expert who kept numerous apartment buildings in proper condition. Shortly before this phone call, William had received an urgent call from a friend, someone eager to boast about something, a confession or a piece of information that could break the case wide open. This new lead was a turning point for the investigators, sending them down a path toward justice for Shona Teefee and hopefully offering some peace to her family in the wake of their immense tragedy. He was happy in a way that made him look as if he had just completed some significant mission for which he would soon be rewarded with a large sum of cash. His expression was one of pure satisfaction, a feeling of accomplishment, even a rush of adrenaline. During his story, his friend, meanwhile, was laughing with unmistakable pleasure as if he had performed a heroic deed. And this filled William, Big Will, with deep resentment and disbelief. This was not something he could celebrate or appreciate in any way. Big Will tried his best to live a righteous, upstanding life under the Lord's guidance, as he often put it. His moral compass was strong. He made it a point to aid those in need, especially people who had stumbled or gone down a difficult path, individuals who had gotten out of prison and were looking for a chance at redemption. This was precisely why the story his friend was openly bragging about struck him as reprehensible and completely unacceptable. This crossed a moral boundary that Big Will could not ignore. It went far beyond the kind of people he was normally willing to help. The following morning, after wrestling with his conscience all night, Will decided it was his civic and moral duty to come forward and report what he knew to the police. At first, his message seemed somewhat implausible to the detectives, almost a wild tale that fell outside the ordinary course of crimes. Nevertheless, the police decided to follow up and see whether there might be a kernel of truth in his words. The man Big Will was worried about was a person named Neil Stevens. Stevens lived in a small, somewhat clandestine spot at the foot of the hills, far away from the glittering city center with its hotels, restaurants, and bustling tourists. Stevens was a former inmate, someone Big Will had been trying to help him find a new path in life, a path toward honesty, stability, and peace. Because William didn't know his friend's exact address, he instead led the police to a nearby grocery store where Stevens was frequently seen, and by pure coincidence, the detectives stumbled upon their suspect there, on the corner of a side street, quietly minding his own business. The officers proceeded to arrest Stevens due to prohibited substances found in his possession and transported him to the police station for questioning. The homeless man insisted he hadn't done anything related to Shona Teefee's death. He repeatedly said the police had made a mess by arresting him. He was the wrong person. Detectives, meanwhile, began to doubt their own assumptions. They couldn't see a clear connection between a vagrant with a small record, a man previously convicted of theft, unlawful possession, or disturbing the peace, and a respectable woman whose death seemed so puzzling. Until this moment, none of his crimes had involved violence or aggression toward another person. Furthermore, there seemed to be no realistic motive for him to harm Shona Tiffy. To be exhaustive in their search for the truth, the detectives decided to track down Stevens's temporary dwelling, the small, worn-out tent that he called home, and see if there was anything there that might provide additional clues or physical evidence. During their search, a team of forensic experts stumbled upon several crucial finds. Among them was a pair of pants that, after subsequent testing, turned out to carry traces of Shona's DNA, a piece of physical evidence tying him directly to the victim. Inside the small, tattered refuge, the investigators also found a price tag with a barcode from a hammer that had been purchased at a nearby supermarket just a short time before the incident. Back at police headquarters, the detectives presented this new information to Neil Stevens. They decided to use a tactic frequently used in difficult cases. They suggested to him that someone might be framing him and that it was in his best interest to come clean and tell them everything he knew. This tactic produced a dramatic result. Instead of denying his guilt, Stevens fell silent for a moment, then nodded and began to confess. He openly admitted that he was indeed the person who attacked Shona Tiffy. His confession fell from him piece by piece, a story filled with details. Yet there was a key piece missing. Detectives couldn't initially understand his motives. Why would he attack Shona in particular? What had driven him to commit this awful act? The answer to their growing number of questions came to light when the police examined Stevens's phone. Among its many contacts, there was a name that stood out: George. Detectives asked him directly who George was, and Stevens reluctantly explained that George was his friend, the firefighter, a man he knew well. This George turned out to be none other than George Tiffy, Shona's own husband. Neil Stevens was the homeless man whom George had hired from time to time to do small, odd jobs around their home and garden, a person who had inadvertently become a point of conflict and controversy in their marriage. George's phone number appeared repeatedly in the call log, a total of 87 exchanges in the last month before Shona's death, adding a dramatic twist to the case. The two men had a hidden understanding. One needed money, while the other wanted to undermine his wife's happiness, creating a conspiracy forged by resentment, financial struggles, and a growing domestic crisis. This unusual alliance fell into place piece by piece until the true story was made clear to the investigators. A story of betrayal, weakness, and tragedy. He very skillfully manipulated the vulnerable vagrant, who literally hung on his every word. Stevens saw him as a kind of older brother, a friend, a person he could trust completely. In many ways, George Tiffy filled a void in his life, someone he admired and was eager to please at any cost. Stevens openly said he idolized George, believing him to be his closest friend, someone who truly cared for him when nobody else did. This loyalty made him ready to do anything George asked of him, even something unimaginable. Then the team of detectives turned their attention toward a crucial piece of physical evidence, the price tag from the hammer. And their subsequent inquiry revealed that it had been purchased at a nearby major retail store. This new lead opened up a path for investigators to piece together the timeline of events. They painstakingly reviewed hundreds upon hundreds of hours of surveillance camera footage, a task that seemed exhaustive and overwhelming, but their persistence eventually paid off. Finally, a breakthrough came when the investigators noticed George Tiffy and Neil Stevens together in the recordings, casually shopping side by side, placing a hammer, a ski mask, and black-colored clothing into their cart. The video clearly captured their faces, smiling, talking, and looking completely at ease, a moment that would become a key piece of testimony in court. Meanwhile, Stevens continued to share his side of the story with the investigators in greater depth. According to him, George had offered him $600 to carry out the killing of his own wife, Shona, with the understanding that several $1,000s more would be handed over once George received a payout from her life insurance policy. The small burglary that had taken place just a few weeks prior was meant as a kind of trial run, A way for Stevens to familiarize himself with the layout of Shona's home and its entry points in case something went awry. George even allowed him to steal his wife's wedding ring and pawn it, adding a small financial incentive, a perverted form of a tip, for a man wrestling with difficult financial struggles. Eventually, under mounting pressure, the suspect voluntarily agreed to show the police where he had buried the actual murder weapon, a heavy tool that had been used to carry out the attack. This marked a turning point in the case, adding a crucial piece of physical proof alongside the suspect's testimony. In the end, everything that the arrest of Neil Stevens revealed was more than enough to enable the arrest of George Toffee as an accomplice in this tragedy. However, instead of proceeding directly with arresting the firefighter on the suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder, investigators made a somewhat unusual decision. For some reason, they first called his mother and sister and quietly informed them that George was suspected of being involved in a serious crime against Shona. This phone call, made on the 9th day after Shona's death, turned the suspect's family's world upside down. As soon as the relatives learned the bitter and painful truth, they rushed to dial George's phone number in a state of disbelief and alarm. A few minutes after this phone conversation, the team of police officers, who were already keeping George Toffee under surveillance and closely monitoring his phone, overheard his sister calling him to tell him he was now suspected of taking his wife's life. Shortly after that, George darted out of his residence, jumped into his truck, and sped away down the highway in a dramatic and desperate attempt to escape whatever fate might await him. George Toffee weaved recklessly through city streets and then turned onto Summerlin Parkway. His vehicle accelerated to a breakneck 85 miles per hour before he suddenly and violently crashed into a barrier alongside the highway. Police later described this incident as a suspected end-it-all attempt, noting that there were no skid marks, a clear sign that George hadn't tried to slow down or avoid the collision. His intent appeared to be quite deliberate. However, much to everyone's astonishment, George Toffee survived the collision. According to emergency responders, he was wearing a seatbelt, which kept him alive upon impact. He was rushed to a nearby hospital where doctors treated his injuries, and where detectives subsequently placed him under arrest. When George was formally presented with the charges that he was suspected of organizing the killing of Shona Toffee, he simply raised his gaze from his hospital bed, nodded quietly, and said, "Okay." Meanwhile, back at the police station, Neil Stevens was also formally charged in the killing. All of these revelations came as a shock to Shona's family, adding to their immense tragedy, yet there was a small measure of relief. If George Toffee's suicide attempt had been successful, he might have avoided justice, adding further agony for the victim's relatives. But instead, he remained alive and would face trial alongside his accomplice. More than 3 months after their arrest, Neil Stevens chose to plead guilty to taking Shona Toffee's life. In exchange for this confession, and for agreeing not to pursue the death penalty, the prosecutor insisted that he must provide testimony against George. The main challenge was that Stevens was still fiercely loyal to George and seemed unsure whether he could bring himself to speak against him. Nevertheless, this person was quite vulnerable and easily influenced, which meant the lawyers were able to persuade him to become a key state's witness. Later, in August 2015, at the court hearing, Neil Stevens did everything he could to explain to the jury in vivid detail exactly what had happened, how he fell under George's influence, and how together they fell into a conspiracy that resulted in tragedy. The defense team fiercely challenged Stevens' entire account during cross-examination, putting forward every possible inconsistency and casting doubt upon his credibility as a key witness in the case. Big Will, who also appeared in court to provide testimony for the prosecution, was not spared from this aggressive questioning. During cross-examination, he reluctantly admitted that Stevens was not a person whose words should be trusted without careful scrutiny. This moment seemed to undermine the state's case, fueling suspicion that their principal testimony might be less reliable than first believed. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavy with doubt, the kind of doubt that could make a jury reconsider its view on a person's guilt. The main objective for the prosecutors was not just to rely on the testimony of a questionable accomplice. Their aim was to show the jury that George Toffee was fully capable of organizing and executing a brutal crime. Prosecutors presented a significant amount of incriminating evidence to help connect George Toffee directly to the conspiracy.